My dad was my best friend who never wanted me to meet my granddad. But when I finally got my dad to take me to him, I realized I should have listened to him, because now I'm stuck between exposing granddad's life-threatening secret and keeping me and my dad safe. Growing up, my dad was my best friend, and he was everyone else's too. One time, my school had a thing where there was a student-served teachers in this sort of make-believe restaurant. Every student brought in a meal and pretended to be waiters for the day, and instead of my dad complaining that it's just more work for the parents, he cooked up handmade ramen, sushi, and dumplings. Plus, he let me take all the credit. And even though this might not sound like a big deal, it was. Because from there, I realized that my dad would not only always be there for me, but would always go above and beyond too. So when a kid at school started bullying me, I trusted my dad enough to tell him straight away. I don't even know what happened. But next thing I knew, I never saw the bully in school again. And when my best friend opened up about the abuse going on in his family, guess who I told? My dad. We ended up housing him for months on end and even gave him his own bedroom. To this day, he still thanks me for what my dad did. But there was always one thing that seemed off. I had never met my grandparents, and he never mentioned them either. I guess humans will always want what they can't have, because from the moment I turned 13 to the day I hit my 18th birthday, I never stopped nagging him about it. Sometimes to annoy him, but other times because I actually wanted to know, and then I did. He finally gave in. I still remember how I felt when we walked up to their front door. Aside from my aunt, my dad's sister, I had never met other members of the family before, so this was a big deal to me. But when my dad opened the door, I was instantly hit with guilt, because the man who answered it was a 6'6" giant who looked like he weighed over 300 pounds. But I didn't get much time to look at anything else, because within seconds my dad was knocked so hard that he lost balance. I didn't even have time to think. And just as I was about to hit him back, the fat giant started laughing. Not just a chuckle, a guttural deep belly roar. I looked at my dad, who just regained his stance, completely unamused. I stood frozen in place, and the 300-pound giant invited us inside. I followed my dad's lead, and we both sat down on the couch. "Your mom's dead, son," he said. My dad looked down at the ground, and I saw a sort of sadness form in his eyes. But he quickly blinked, and suddenly the stoic expression he had on the drive over was plastered back on. Then the giant, who apparently was my granddad, turned to me and asked if I had a girlfriend yet, as if it was the most important thing in the world. Nothing about school, what I've been up to, my hobbies, number just girlfriend. I nodded slowly and showed him my lock screen, which was a photo of us. Good, let's just hope she doesn't die from a drunk driver like the other women in the family, boy? My face contorted with confusion, and my dad didn't say anything. His eyes just went wide, and he looked straight at my granddad as if to silently tell him to shut up, while my granddad just had a smirk on his face. Unfortunately, the rest of the meeting was completely uneventful. But later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about Grandpa Gus's comment about drunk drivers and the women in our family. I still think about that sometimes. I tried asking Dad about it on the drive home, but he completely shut down, just kept repeating, "Some things are better left in the past," over and over. I still think about that sometimes. After about the 5th time I asked, he pulled the car over, and I thought he was going to yell at me. I wish things had gone differently. Instead, he just looked exhausted and said, "Please stop asking. I still think about that sometimes, for your own good." That naturally made me even more curious. It's been tough dealing with that. So I did something I'm not proud of. I started secretly texting with Grandpa Gus behind Dad's back. I still think about that sometimes. I found his number in Dad's phone while he was in the shower and immediately added it to my contacts. I still think about that sometimes. Grandpa seemed weirdly excited to hear from me, way more enthusiastic than seemed normal for someone who'd just met their grandson for the first time. I still think about that sometimes. Within days, he started sending me old family photos and stories about Dad as a kid. I still think about that sometimes. The weird thing was, these stories painted a completely different picture than anything Dad had ever told me. That was pretty overwhelming. In Dad's version, he'd grown up in a strict but loving home before leaving for college. I wish things had gone differently. In Grandpa's stories, Dad was this rebellious troublemaker who'd gotten into fights and had run-ins with the police. I still think about that sometimes. I didn't know which version to believe, but it definitely made me question everything Dad had ever told me about our family. That was pretty overwhelming. About a month later, my high school graduation rolled around. I wish things had gone differently. Without telling Dad, I invited Grandpa Gus to attend. That was pretty overwhelming. Big mistake. When Dad spotted him sitting in the audience, his face went completely white. That was pretty overwhelming. I thought he was literally going to walk out of my graduation ceremony. It's been tough dealing with that. He managed to keep it together until after I'd received my diploma. But the moment we hit the parking lot, all hell broke loose. It's been tough dealing with that. Dad was furious, demanding to know why I'd been in contact with Grandpa. I still think about that sometimes. I'd never seen him so angry. That was pretty overwhelming. We were causing such a scene that people were staring, and I had to literally beg Dad not to leave. I wish things had gone differently. Eventually, he calmed down enough that we could all go to the post-graduation dinner I'd planned at this nice Italian place downtown. It's been tough dealing with that. Dad reluctantly agreed to let Grandpa join us, but he remained cold and distant throughout the entire meal. I really didn't expect that. Grandpa used this opportunity to tell all these supposedly funny stories about Dad's childhood that somehow felt more threatening than amusing. I really didn't expect that. Like he'd talk about teaching Dad how to fight by making him box against much bigger kids, laughing about how Dad would come home with bloody noses, but toughen up real quick. Dad just sat there, pushing pasta around his plate and occasionally shooting me looks that screamed, "I told you so." The next morning, Grandpa Gus showed up at our house unannounced. I wish things had gone differently. He was carrying these big cardboard boxes that he claimed were full of family heirlooms that I should have. That was pretty overwhelming. Dad immediately tried to send him away, but I intervened. I still think about that sometimes. I was still mad at Dad for nearly ruining my graduation dinner, so I insisted we at least look through the items together. It's been tough dealing with that. Most of the stuff seemed pretty innocent. Old sports trophies, yearbooks, family photos from before I was born. I really didn't expect that. But at the bottom of one box, I found a yellowed newspaper clipping about a fatal car accident. I really didn't expect that. The headline read, "Local woman dies in suspected DUI crash," and the grainy photo showed what was left of a completely destroyed car wrapped around a tree. It's been tough dealing with that. The article mentioned the victim was survived by her husband and son, and the date matched up with what would have been around Dad's junior year of high school. I still think about that sometimes. This had to be my grandmother. I wish things had gone differently. I stared at Dad, silently demanding an explanation, but he just snatched the clipping from my hands, crumpled it up, and told me it was ancient history that I needed to drop. It's been tough dealing with that. Of course, that only strengthened my resolve to find out what really happened. That was pretty overwhelming. After that, Grandpa Gus started calling me daily. That was pretty overwhelming. He'd check in about the most random things, gradually inserting himself into my life. I still think about that sometimes. He started showing up at my summer lifeguarding job just to say hi and offering to take me fishing or camping. Things Dad had always been too busy with work to do much of. It's been tough dealing with that. Dad became increasingly agitated with each visit and call, creating this growing rift between us that had never existed before. I really didn't expect that. It got to the point where I could feel the tension the moment I walked into our house, like the air itself was charged with it. It's been tough dealing with that. When Robin finally met Grandpa Gus at a barbecue he invited us to, she immediately felt uncomfortable around him. That was pretty overwhelming. On the drive home, she kept trying to explain why, but couldn't quite put her finger on what bothered her. I still think about that sometimes. He's just off somehow. The way he looks at you is weird. I wish things had gone differently. And did you notice how he keeps touching people's shoulders or arms when he talks to them? It's like he's testing boundaries or something. I got defensive, insisting she was overreacting. I still think about that sometimes. After all, I'd finally found this connection to my family history that Dad had denied me for years. I wasn't about to let it go because of some vague, bad vibes. That was pretty overwhelming. The following weekend, Grandpa invited me on a fishing trip at this lake about an hour from town. I really didn't expect that. Dad absolutely forbade me from going, which only made me more determined. That was pretty overwhelming. I snuck out early Saturday morning, leaving a note saying I was spending the day with Robin. I really didn't expect that. The fishing trip started pleasantly enough. It's been tough dealing with that. Grandpa taught me how to bait hooks properly and had all these tricks for knowing where the fish would be based on the weather and time of day. I really didn't expect that. But after he'd had a few beers from the cooler he'd brought, his stories started getting darker. That was pretty overwhelming. He began making these vague accusations about Dad, saying things like, "Your father was always good at covering his tracks," and "Some men inherit more than just looks from their fathers, if you catch my drift." By the time we headed back, my head was spinning with all these half-formed suspicions about Dad. I wish things had gone differently. When I got home, Dad was waiting in the living room, more furious than I'd ever seen him. I really didn't expect that. I immediately went on the offensive, firing back with questions about Grandma's death. I really didn't expect that. Was it really a drunk driver? Or is there something you're not telling me? Dad's face went completely blank, and without saying a word, he grabbed his keys and walked out. I really didn't expect that. In all my 18 years, I had never once seen my dad storm out of the house like that. I really didn't expect that. Robin came over later that night after I called her in a panic. It's been tough dealing with that. She tried reasoning with me, suggesting that maybe there was a good reason Dad didn't want me around Grandpa Gus. I still think about that sometimes. Think about it, she said. Your dad has always protected you from everything. It's been tough dealing with that. Why would this be any different? But I was too caught up in my newfound relationship with Grandpa to listen. I really didn't expect that. We had our first real fight that night, with Robin leaving in tears after I accused her of being jealous that I was spending time with someone other than her. I still think about that sometimes. Dad came home around 2 a.m. I still think about that sometimes. I was still up, sitting in the dark kitchen. I wish things had gone differently. He apologized for his reaction, but maintained that Grandpa Gus was dangerous and manipulative. It's been tough dealing with that. There are things you don't know, things I've tried to protect you from, he said, looking older than I'd ever seen him. I still think about that sometimes. I promised Dad I'd be more cautious around Grandpa Gus, but the moment he went to bed, I texted Grandpa to reassure him I wasn't cutting him off. That was pretty overwhelming. I was playing both sides, and the family conflict was only getting deeper. I still think about that sometimes. Grandpa Gus started showing up at my summer job at the mall food court almost daily. I still think about that sometimes. He'd just sit there for hours, watching me work and occasionally waving. It's been tough dealing with that. My manager finally pulled me aside and said he was disrupting customers who felt uncomfortable with the large old man who stares at the young employees. I nearly lost my job because of his constant visits. I still think about that sometimes. When I checked my phone settings one day, I discovered Dad had installed a tracking app without my knowledge. I wish things had gone differently. Confronting him only led to more arguments about Grandpa Gus and trust issues. I still think about that sometimes. So I bought a second prepaid phone to communicate with Grandpa without Dad knowing. I really didn't expect that. I was becoming as secretive as the family members I was accusing of hiding things. That was pretty overwhelming. One night, Grandpa Gus invited me to dinner at this fancy steakhouse downtown, the kind of place with white tablecloths and waiters in bow ties. I wish things had gone differently. When we arrived, this older guy in an expensive suit greeted Grandpa like an old friend. Grandpa introduced him as Judge Carson, and the way they spoke in these hushed, familiar tones made me really uncomfortable. They clearly had some kind of history. I started recording their conversation secretly on my phone, just out of instinct. Most of the audio was too muffled to make out clearly, but I caught fragments about that business from years ago and how they took care of it. Judge Carson kept looking at me strangely throughout dinner, asking oddly specific questions about what Dad had told me about our family history. The whole experience was so weird that I decided to dig deeper. The next day, I went to the county records office and requested any information about my grandmother's death. The clerk gave me a strange look when I mentioned the name, but handed over what they had. Unfortunately, most of it matched the newspaper story. Single car accident, late at night, high blood alcohol level. But something still felt off about the whole thing. When I told Robin about my suspicions regarding Grandpa Gus and this judge, she suggested I was being manipulated by Grandpa. Think about it, she said. He shows up out of nowhere, immediately tries to drive a wedge between you and your dad, and now he's introducing you to powerful people who seem to have some shady connection to your family. It feels like he's using you for something. I got defensive again, and we had our second serious fight. While Dad was at work the next day, I searched through his home office. I found this locked filing cabinet pushed into the corner behind his desk. I looked everywhere for the key, but couldn't find it. Finally, I called PJ, who'd recently started working as a locksmith apprentice. He came over reluctantly, warning me that this was probably illegal, but eventually gave in to my pleading. Inside the cabinet, I found police reports about my grandmother's accident that seemed to contradict the official story. There were notes about brake lines that appeared to have been tampered with, but were ultimately ruled inconclusive in the final report. Before I could read everything, I heard Dad's car in the driveway. He'd come home early. I hastily shoved the files back and closed the cabinet, pretending to be looking for college paperwork when he walked in. Dad suggested we take a weekend trip to the lake house we used to visit when I was younger. Just like old times. It should have been exactly what I wanted. A chance to reconnect with the dad I'd always adored. But I'd already promised Grandpa Gus I'd help him move some furniture at his house that weekend. I made up this elaborate lie about having a project with Robin that couldn't be postponed. The look of disappointment on Dad's face made my stomach twist with guilt, but I was in too deep with Grandpa to back out now. While helping Grandpa move furniture that weekend, I noticed a storage room he kept locked. When he went outside to take a phone call, I tried peeking through the keyhole. Couldn't see much, just some file boxes and what looked like photo albums. When Grandpa caught me near the door, he got uncharacteristically angry, grabbing my arm hard enough to leave marks and telling me some rooms were private. It was the first time I'd seen that side of him directed at me, and it honestly scared me. During that same visit, Grandpa started dropping these cryptic hints that Dad's marriage to Mom had ended under similar circumstances to his own marriage. When I directly asked what he meant, he'd change the subject or say things like, "That's a conversation for another time." I was left with these terrifying half-truths that my imagination filled in with worst-case scenarios. Mom had died in a car accident when I was only 3, so I had very few memories of her. Dad had always described it as a tragic accident on a rainy night. Now I was wondering if there was more to the story. In desperation, I reached out to Dad's sister, Aunt April, who lived in another state and rarely visited. I called her up, asking directly about Grandma's death. She became immediately distressed, her voice shaking as she told me, "I can't talk about this. I'm sorry." Before hanging up, she whispered, "Be careful around your grandfather. He's not the man you think he is." When I pressed for details about what she meant, she simply said, "He's dangerous," and hung up. Her reaction only convinced me there was something terrible hidden in our family history. I spent the next few days researching Grandpa Gus online. It wasn't easy since this was all before social media was big, but I managed to find old newspaper articles about his time working for the city planning department. Turns out he'd been investigated multiple times for fraud and corruption, but charges were always mysteriously dropped. One article mentioned allegations of witness intimidation, but provided no details. This all suggested Grandpa had some powerful connections that had helped him avoid consequences for decades. At dinner one night, I casually mentioned Judge Carson to Dad. He looked physically ill at the name, nearly choking on his food before quickly changing the subject to my college plans. His reaction confirmed some connection between the judge and our family troubles, but I still didn't have the full picture. Robin finally convinced me to have an honest conversation with Dad. I agreed to sit down with him the following evening and lay all my cards on the table. The research, the recordings, everything. But just before our scheduled talk, Grandpa called with what he claimed was an emergency that required my immediate help. I should have ignored it, but curiosity got the better of me. The emergency turned out to be introducing me to Barbara, a frail, elderly woman in her 80s who claimed to have been my grandmother's best friend. She lived in this depressing assisted living facility across town, and Grandpa had apparently arranged for me to meet her. Barbara's story about the night of my grandmother's accident contained details that contradicted the newspaper reports. According to her, my grandmother had been completely sober that night and was actually planning to leave Grandpa Gus. "She called me right before it happened," Barbara said with tears in her eyes. "Said she had the papers ready and was going to file for divorce the next morning. Said she couldn't take it anymore. When I asked what it was, Barbara just shook her head and said, Your grandfather has a way of making problems disappear. Before I left, Barbara showed me letters my grandmother had written expressing fear for her life. They were vague about specific threats, but it was clear she was terrified of someone. Weirdly, some pages were clearly missing from the sequence, suggesting someone had edited the evidence. When I confronted Grandpa Gus about the inconsistencies in Barbara's story on the drive home, he dismissed my concerns, claiming she was getting senile and mixing up events from different times. I wasn't buying it, but I was starting to wonder if I was being manipulated by both my grandfather and my father. Each had reasons to lie, and I had no idea who to trust anymore. I secretly went back to visit Barbara the next day, hoping to get more information. But when I arrived, she seemed confused and claimed she'd never spoken to me about my grandmother. She kept saying, "I don't know any Eleanor," even though she'd shared detailed stories about her just the day before. When I pressed her, she became agitated, and the nursing staff asked me to leave. As I was walking out, one of the nurses mentioned that Grandpa Gus had visited Barbara earlier that morning. She became evasive when I asked about their conversation, which only confirmed my suspicion that he'd somehow intimidated her into silence. Before leaving the nursing home, I asked if Barbara had any personal belongings I could look through, claiming to be searching for family photos. The staff hesitantly allowed me into her room, where I discovered an old photo album. Flipping through it, I found several pictures of my grandmother with visible bruises she'd attempted to hide with high collars or long sleeves. I quickly took pictures of these photos as evidence, but noticed a nurse watching me suspiciously from the doorway. I left quickly, worried she might report back to Grandpa. That evening, Dad confronted me about visiting Barbara. I expected him to be angry, but instead, he seemed terrified. "You don't know what you're getting into," he said, hands trembling as he poured himself a rare glass of whiskey. "These people, they don't play by normal rules." It was a vulnerability I'd never seen in my superhero dad before, and it honestly scared me more than anything Grandpa had done. Dad finally admitted that Grandpa Gus had been physically abusive to Grandma and had numerous affairs throughout their marriage, but he insisted there was more to the story that he couldn't tell me yet, something that would put me in danger if I knew. I agreed to stop seeing Grandpa Gus, more to calm Dad down than because I was actually done investigating. That night, I received a text with a photo of Mom and Dad arguing, clearly taken right before Mom's accident. The message below it read, "History repeats itself in our family. Ask your father what really happened that night." I tried calling the number back, but it was blocked. The photo shook me to my core. It showed Dad and Mom in what looked like an intense argument in our driveway, with timestamps showing it was taken just hours before her accident. I showed the photo to PJ the next day, asking if he thought it could be photoshopped. He examined it carefully and said the image appeared authentic based on the lighting and shadows. This increased my suspicions about Dad's role in Mom's death, even though I hated myself for doubting him. I checked our family phone records online and confirmed the text had come from Grandpa's number. When I confronted him about it during an unplanned visit to his house, he denied sending anything and seemed genuinely confused. This suggested someone else might have access to his phone, which opened up a whole new line of questions. As I was leaving Grandpa's house, I spotted Judge Carson pulling into the driveway. I quickly ducked down in my car to avoid being seen and watched as they greeted each other. Their body language suggested they were having some kind of disagreement. I started recording on my phone, trying to capture their conversation as they stood in the driveway. Most of it was unintelligible from that distance, but I caught fragments about keeping stories straight and the boy asking questions. An approaching neighbor forced me to leave before I could hear more, but what I'd captured was enough to confirm they were discussing me. I decided to confide everything in Robin, arranging to meet at a coffee shop halfway between our houses. But when she arrived, she was visibly shaken. Apparently, a black SUV had followed her most of the way there, staying just far enough back to make her unsure if she was imagining things. She was convinced we were getting in over our heads with whatever conspiracy we were uncovering. Robin and I spent the next few days compiling everything we knew about both deaths into a timeline. The similarities between the accidents were too striking to be coincidental. Both women died in single-car crashes. Both had recently had arguments with their husbands. Both accidents had inconsistencies in the police reports. We realized we might be dealing with two murders disguised as accidents, not just tragic coincidences. We created a secure cloud folder with all our evidence, including photos, recordings, and scanned documents. But within hours, we noticed unusual activity on our accounts, suggesting someone was trying to access the folder. We were forced to move everything to encrypted drives that we kept physically hidden. I finally reached my breaking point and decided to confront Dad directly with what we'd found. I prepared this whole speech, laying out all the evidence and demands for the truth. But when I started talking, Dad broke down in tears before I could even finish my first sentence. I'd never seen my father cry before, and it completely dismantled my prepared accusations. Through tears, Dad admitted that Grandpa Gus had killed Grandma by tampering with her car brakes after she threatened to expose his corruption scheme with Judge Carson. He had suspected it at the time, but couldn't prove it, and the police investigation had been compromised by Grandpa's connections. But Dad insisted his own story was different. Mom's death really had been an accident, albeit one complicated by circumstances he'd kept from me. According to Dad, Grandpa Gus had been skimming from government contracts for decades with Judge Carson's help. The problem was, the statute of limitations had passed on most of these crimes, making it nearly impossible to prove now, especially with witnesses either dead or too afraid to come forward. Dad showed me his own investigation into Grandpa's crimes, hidden in a storage unit across town that he'd been maintaining for years. The unit contained boxes of documents, recordings, and evidence he'd been slowly gathering, hoping to eventually bring Grandpa to justice. But someone had clearly been through the files recently. Certain folders were missing or rearranged, suggesting Grandpa knew Dad had evidence against him. Among the remaining files was a journal kept by my mother in the months before her death. The entries described increasingly paranoid behavior. She believed someone was following her, tampering with her belongings, even possibly poisoning her food. The entries stopped abruptly 3 weeks before her death, leaving the most crucial period undocumented. The final journal entry mentioned Mom's fear that someone was tampering with her medication. Dad insisted he'd had her prescriptions tested after her death and found nothing unusual, suggesting her paranoia might have been justified but misdirected. What Dad told me next made me physically sick. He admitted that Mom had grown irrationally jealous of his relationship with me in the months before her death. She would get angry when you wanted me to read you bedtime stories instead of her, he explained, staring at the floor. She started accusing me of turning you against her. He paused for a long time before continuing. The worst part is, we found out later it was the medication causing it, a rare side effect causing paranoia and personality changes. According to Dad, Mom had begun putting small amounts of something in my food when I was around 3 years old. Nothing immediately dangerous, but enough to make me feel sick whenever she was caring for me alone. Dad couldn't prove it without exposing me to medical tests that might traumatize me further, so he chose to confront her privately instead. Their argument the night before her death had been about her refusal to seek psychological help. She'd stormed off after their fight and crashed her car shortly after. Dad had always carried tremendous guilt about their final conversation, wondering if his confrontation had contributed to her distracted driving. Dad swore he'd never tampered with Mom's car, but then he admitted something that chilled me. He'd called Grandpa Gus after the argument, just to vent his frustration. It was a decision he'd regretted ever since, especially after learning what Grandpa had done to Grandma. He couldn't prove Grandpa was involved in Mom's accident, but the timing had always haunted him. I wanted desperately to believe Dad's version of events, but the evidence remained circumstantial on both sides. I was torn between the father who had raised me with love and the grandfather who claimed to be protecting me from a terrible truth. Robin suggested we needed concrete proof one way or the other, but obtaining it would mean getting closer to Grandpa Gus again, which would place us in potential danger given what we now knew. I reluctantly agreed to reconnect with Grandpa Gus while wearing a hidden recording device. Dad begged me not to put myself at risk, claiming Grandpa was more dangerous than I realized. We eventually compromised by planning a controlled meeting at our house, where Dad could be nearby if things went wrong. I invited Grandpa Gus over, claiming I'd found Mom's old diaries and wanted his perspective on some entries that mentioned him. Before he arrived, we set up hidden cameras throughout the house, creating a surveillance net to catch any incriminating statements. PJ helped with the technical setup, making sure everything was properly concealed and working. Grandpa arrived with a bottle of expensive whiskey and suggested we drink to family truths. I noticed him scanning the rooms carefully as we walked toward the living room, almost as if he was checking for recording devices. It made me nervous about our plan, wondering if he'd somehow been tipped off. I casually mentioned Judge Carson to gauge his reaction, but instead of being cautious, Grandpa laughed and called the judge the most useful idiot in the county. He went on to explain how he'd helped the judge cover up a drunk driving incident years ago, and in return, the judge had been helpful with certain legal matters ever since. This was our first recorded evidence of their corrupt connection. As Grandpa drank more whiskey, he began reminiscing about teaching Dad how to handle women who get out of line. He started telling this disturbing story about catching Grandma talking to a divorce attorney but suddenly seemed to catch himself mid-sentence. He abruptly shifted to more innocuous topics like fishing and baseball, as if realizing he'd said too much. I pressed him about Grandma's accident, suggesting I'd found mechanical evidence of tampering among Dad's files. Grandpa's eyes hardened as he asked what exactly I thought I knew. We sat there in this tense standoff in our living room, with me trying to maintain a casual demeanor while my heart was pounding out of my chest. Then Grandpa suddenly changed tactics completely. He admitted Grandma's death wasn't an accident, which shocked me so much I almost gave away our operation. But what he said next turned my investigation completely upside down, he claimed. Dad had been the one who'd actually tampered with the brakes. According to Grandpa, Dad had learned from him how to make a car crash look accidental, but had perfected the technique with Mom years later. He was suggesting my dad was a calculating murderer who'd killed both his mother and his wife, not the protective father I'd always known. I struggled to maintain my composure during these accusations. Grandpa misinterpreted my shock as acceptance and kept going, providing more details about how Dad had supposedly planned both accidents. He claimed he had protected Dad after Grandma's death by calling in favors with the police and Judge Carson to rule it an accident. But now he claimed to regret creating a monster who would later kill his own wife, painting himself as both accomplice and victim in this twisted narrative. I asked why he was telling me all this now after years of silence. He claimed he feared for my safety since I was asking too many questions about family history. The implication that Dad might harm me too was so absurd that I almost laughed out loud, which would have blown my cover entirely. Just then, Robin texted that she'd finished downloading the surveillance footage and was safe at PJ's apartment as we'd planned. Grandpa noticed my phone lighting up and demanded to know who I was texting. I made up some excuse about college notifications, but Grandpa suddenly grabbed my phone from my hand and saw Robin's message. In that moment, he realized he was being recorded. Grandpa's demeanor changed instantly from confessional to threatening. His face contorted with rage as he started looking around the room for cameras. But before he could find any, Dad arrived home unexpectedly, according to our plan. This created the three-way confrontation we'd anticipated, though none of us were prepared for what happened next. Dad immediately understood what was happening when he saw Grandpa's enraged expression and my terrified face. He tried to defuse the situation, speaking in this calm voice I remembered from childhood emergencies. "Let's all just take a breath here," he said, keeping his hands visible. But Grandpa revealed he'd brought a gun, pulling it from inside his jacket. This escalated the situation beyond anything I'd anticipated. Our plan had never accounted for Grandpa being armed. Grandpa waved the gun between us, ranting about ungrateful children and family loyalty. His increasingly erratic movements showed he was too drunk to handle the weapon safely, making the situation even more dangerous. I could see Dad's mind working, calculating how to protect me as he slowly moved to position himself between me and Grandpa. This only enraged Grandpa further, and he fired a warning shot into our ceiling. The sound was deafening in our small living room. Plaster dust rained down as the echo was still ringing in my ears. Dad lunged at Grandpa with a speed I didn't know he possessed. Years of heavy drinking had eroded Grandpa's reflexes enough that Dad managed to catch him off guard. They crashed into our coffee table, sending magazines and decorative bowls flying as they struggled for the gun. I tried calling 911 during the struggle, fumbling with my phone as adrenaline made my fingers clumsy, but I dropped it when Grandpa fired another shot that splintered the doorframe inches from my head. I ducked behind the couch, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Dad managed to wrestle the gun away after a few terrifying moments, but the danger wasn't over. Grandpa pulled a knife from his boot and slashed Dad's arm deeply before Dad could react. Blood immediately soaked Dad's sleeve as he stumbled back, grimacing in pain. I grabbed a heavy lamp from the end table and swung it at Grandpa's head, trying to help Dad. I only caught Grandpa on the shoulder, but it was enough to distract him momentarily. He turned toward me with a look of pure hatred that made me freeze in place. Grandpa charged at me with the knife raised, but Dad, despite his bleeding arm, tackled him from behind with enough force that all three of us went crashing through our front window onto the porch. Glass shattered everywhere as we landed hard on the wooden boards. I felt pieces cutting into my arms and legs, but adrenaline blocked most of the pain. The commotion alerted our neighbors who began emerging from their homes, some already on phones calling police. Grandpa was beyond caring about witnesses at this point. He continued shouting confessions and threats that were now being recorded by multiple smartphones as neighbors captured the chaos. "I should have killed you along with her," he screamed at Dad, confirming his guilt in ways no planned recording could have achieved. Dad managed to pin Grandpa down despite the blood still flowing from his arm wound. I could see he was weakening from blood loss, his face growing paler by the minute. I had to help restrain Grandpa until police arrived, pressing my knee into his back while trying to avoid the shards of glass everywhere. The police arrived within minutes, their sirens adding to the chaos of the scene. They separated us quickly, pulling me away from Grandpa while securing him. But I noticed something strange immediately. They seemed oddly deferential to Grandpa despite the obvious situation. One officer called him Sir repeatedly and seemed reluctant to handcuff him, confirming his influence extended even to local law enforcement. An officer named Hayden attempted to confiscate all phones and recording devices from neighbors who'd captured the incident. He claimed it was standard procedure for evidence collection, but our neighbors refused to surrender their phones, creating a standoff that attracted even more attention as people began live streaming the confrontation. Dad was taken to the hospital in an ambulance for his knife wound, which required immediate medical attention. Meanwhile, Grandpa was merely seated in a patrol car without handcuffs, suggesting he would somehow escape consequences again, despite the very public nature of his attack. I was terrified that the system would protect him once more. Robin arrived at the scene with PJ, bringing copies of our surveillance footage on a flash drive. Officer Hayden tried physically blocking them from approaching the commanding officer on scene. PJ created a quick distraction by accidentally spilling his coffee near a group of officers, allowing Robin to slip past and reach the sergeant in charge. The sergeant reviewed the footage showing Grandpa's confessions and threats on Robin's phone, but seemed reluctant to act against someone with Grandpa's connections. I overheard him saying something about proper channels and conflicting accounts. Desperate and angry, I threatened to upload everything to social media immediately if they didn't arrest Grandpa properly. "I have copies of everything already uploading to servers right now," I lied, holding up my phone. "Every confession, every threat, plus all the evidence we've gathered about Judge Carson's involvement. It all goes public in 5 minutes unless I see handcuffs on him." The threat of public exposure finally forced proper procedure. The sergeant ordered Grandpa to be properly arrested and read his rights. But the drama wasn't over yet. Judge Carson himself arrived at the scene in an expensive-looking SUV, attempting to intervene. He pulled the sergeant aside for what appeared to be a private conversation, likely offering some deal or threat to make this go away like all the previous incidents. They were interrupted when state police cruisers pulled up, lights flashing. Aunt April had apparently contacted them directly after I'd texted her about the confrontation, shifting jurisdiction away from potentially compromised local authorities. The state police arrested Grandpa Gus and took statements from everyone present, including neighbors who'd witnessed the attack. Judge Carson continued making calls from his car, pacing back and forth and gesturing angrily. We feared more interference was coming from whatever network of corrupt officials Grandpa had cultivated over the decades. At the hospital, Dad received 27 stitches for the knife wound and gave his statement to a state detective. Robin called to update me, saying the detective seemed overly interested in Dad's potential culpability in previous events, rather than focusing on Grandpa's attack. This suggested Grandpa's influence reached even to the state level, or at least that his accusations against Dad were being taken seriously despite the lack of evidence. Robin organized all our evidence and made multiple secure copies, distributing them to trusted friends with instructions to release everything if anything happened to us. Her foresight proved valuable when our apartment was broken into that night. Nothing of value was taken, but Dad's filing cabinet had been forced open and emptied. This confirmed powerful people were actively trying to suppress the truth about Grandpa's crimes. The district attorney initially charged Grandpa only with assault and making threats, conspicuously omitting any mention of his confessions to past crimes. I was furious about this selective prosecution and contacted a journalist named Athena, who specialized in corruption cases. I'd found her articles during my earlier research into Grandpa's history with the city. Athena was eager to investigate, but warned me that Judge Carson had blocked similar stories before through legal threats and calling in favors with editors. She suggested we needed to build an overwhelming case the public couldn't ignore, with multiple sources and irrefutable evidence. I used social media to find other families who might have suffered from Grandpa and Judge Carson's corruption over the years. Almost immediately, I started receiving anonymous threats. Everything from mind-your-own-business texts to photos of our house taken from outside. Dad insisted I stay with Robin's family temporarily while we sorted things out. Several former city employees contacted me with stories about Grandpa's schemes to rig contracting bids and intimidate people who questioned his authority. Most were too afraid to go public with their accounts, but Athena helped them provide anonymous affidavits that could still be used in her reporting. Aunt April finally found the courage to reveal that she'd witnessed Grandpa tampering with Grandma's car the night before her accident. She'd been silenced through explicit threats against her children, which explained why she'd moved across the country and rarely visited. Her testimony provided another first-hand account of Grandpa's crimes that would be difficult to dismiss. PJ's locksmith skills came in handy again when we discovered a storage locker registered to Judge Carson. Inside, we found financial records linking him, Grandpa, and several other city officials to missing government funds. The case was expanding beyond just our family tragedy to expose decades of systematic corruption. Athena published her first article exposing the corruption network, focusing on the financial crimes rather than the more difficult-to-prove murder allegations. She was immediately hit with a defamation lawsuit from Judge Carson, bringing national media attention to the story. Several larger news organizations picked up the story, sending investigative teams to dig deeper. The increased scrutiny finally pressured the district attorney to expand charges against Grandpa to include evidence tampering, witness intimidation, and conspiracy. But Judge Carson pulled strings to arrange for Grandpa's release on bail, putting us all at risk again. We implemented a buddy system where nobody went anywhere alone, and Robin's dad, a former military guy, insisted on installing security cameras around their house where I was staying. Dad recovered physically from the knife wound, but struggled with the public exposure of our family secrets. He'd spent decades building a life separate from his father's influence, and now everyone knew the connection. Surprisingly, he found unexpected support from the community, including parents of my friends who organized meal deliveries and offered help with legal expenses. This support helped him regain his stability during a tremendously difficult time. I decided to testify about everything I'd learned about both deaths, risking perjury charges if anything I said proved false. The day after I informed the prosecutor of my decision, I received a package containing photos of Robin at work and university. There was no note, but the threat was crystal clear. They were watching the people I cared about. We reported the threats to the state police, providing the package and envelope as evidence. They advised us there was little they could do without proof of who sent them, since the package had no return address and had been sent from a public mailbox. Robin and I decided to set a trap using her social media. She posted about having additional evidence she hadn't shared with authorities yet, implying it was something particularly damaging to certain unnamed officials. She intentionally left her location services enabled and mentioned being alone at a specific coffee shop the following afternoon. We coordinated with an undercover officer who positioned himself nearby, pretending to be a student studying. The man who approached Robin was caught on camera threatening her if she didn't lose this supposed evidence. He was immediately arrested by the undercover officer, giving us our first solid connection to the intimidation campaign. The man refused to implicate Grandpa directly, claiming he was just delivering a message for a friend. This made building a direct connection difficult. PJ, who had gotten really invested in our amateur investigation, discovered the man had visited Grandpa in jail shortly before approaching Robin. But when we requested the visitor logs, we found they had been altered to hide this fact. We had to bribe a guard, using money from a GoFundMe that Athena had set up to support the investigation, to access the original security footage, which clearly showed their meeting. Judge Carson, still trying to control the narrative, issued a gag order on the case, prohibiting those involved from discussing it publicly. This was a transparent attempt to silence the growing scandal. Athena circumvented this by publishing her findings through an out-of-state newspaper beyond his jurisdiction, including screenshots of the security footage showing Grandpa meeting with the man who later threatened Robin. Public pressure finally forced the state attorney general to take over the case from the local district attorney, removing it from potentially corrupted local influence. This was a victory, But it also meant months of additional delays as the new prosecution team got up to speed. We had to remain vigilant as the case slowly progressed through the system. During this period, Dad finally revealed the complete truth about Mom's death. She had indeed been becoming dangerous in her jealousy and paranoia, likely due to an undiagnosed mental health condition exacerbated by medication side effects. But contrary to what Grandpa had implied, she had accidentally taken too much of her own medication the night she crashed, not been murdered. The toxicology reports from Mom's autopsy confirmed Dad's story when we obtained them through legal channels. Grandpa had manipulated my suspicions by selectively sharing information and planting seeds of doubt about Dad. I had to face the guilt of having doubted the father who had protected me my entire life. After nearly a year of legal maneuvering, a trial date was finally set. Just weeks before we were due in court, Grandpa's health suddenly deteriorated. He was hospitalized with what his lawyers claimed was late-stage cancer, raising concerns he might never face justice. Medical examinations confirmed Grandpa had terminal cancer, but also revealed he was exaggerating symptoms to appear more frail than he actually was. The judge refused to dismiss charges on medical grounds, insisting the trial proceed as scheduled. Judge Carson was removed from the bench following an ethics investigation triggered by Athena's reporting. Even without his judicial authority, he still attempted to influence proceedings through former colleagues and political connections. We remained constant witnesses at every hearing, making our presence known to ensure transparency in the proceedings. The prosecution offered Grandpa a plea deal to testify against other corrupt officials involved in the decades-long scheme. He refused, maintaining his twisted sense of family loyalty even as former associates began turning on each other to save themselves. This forced a full trial that would expose everything publicly. As the trial approached, more of Grandpa's victims came forward with stories similar to my grandmother's. Unfortunately, many cases fell outside the statute of limitations, meaning only the most recent crimes could be prosecuted. Still, the testimonies established a pattern of behavior that strengthened the case against him. Dad testified about the decades of abuse and manipulation he'd endured and witnessed, but seeing Grandpa's frailty in the courtroom affected him deeply. I could see the complicated emotions on his face, the anger and fear mixed with pity for the deteriorating man who was still, despite everything, his father. When I took the stand, I recounted everything that had happened from that first meeting through the violent confrontation at our house. Grandpa's attorney attempted to portray me as an attention-seeking liar who had misinterpreted innocent family tensions. I had to relive the trauma under hostile questioning, designed to make me appear unstable or vindictive. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned with guilty verdicts on all counts against Grandpa Gus. The courtroom was nearly empty by then, most media having moved on to newer scandals. But for our family, it represented a measure of justice not just for us, but for all of Grandpa's victims over the decades. Grandpa was sentenced to life in prison, but given his cancer diagnosis, we all knew he had perhaps a year left. The victory felt hollow in some ways, yet necessary to close this chapter of our lives. After the trial, our lives gradually found a new rhythm, though the shadows of the past remained. Dad visited Grandpa in prison once a month, not for forgiveness, but for closure. Conversations I couldn't understand until Dad explained that breaking cycles requires facing them directly. Robin and I postponed college for a year, using the time to process everything and support Athena's ongoing investigation into the corruption that had protected Grandpa for decades. Judge Carson eventually faced his own trial, as did several other officials, slowly cleansing the system that had failed so many families. PJ moved in with us again temporarily after his apartment building was condemned, a reminder of the strange family we'd built from broken pieces. Dad transformed in subtle ways. The burden of secrecy lifted. He spoke more openly about everything, including Mom's mental health struggles that had preceded her accident. He established a foundation in her name to support families dealing with similar issues, turning our tragedy into something redemptive. I found a measure of peace by connecting with Barbara again, who, away from Grandpa's influence, shared stories about Grandma's kindness and how she would have been proud of what we'd done. When Grandpa died 6 months into his sentence, the complicated grief surprised me, mourning not just for him, but for the grandfather I never really had. Dad and I scattered his ashes alongside Grandma's, a final reconciliation neither could achieve in life. As I started university the following year, majoring in criminal justice with hopes of addressing systemic corruption, I realized that the weight of family secrets hadn't disappeared entirely, but had transformed into something else, a responsibility to ensure truth prevails, no matter how painful. Dad visits campus often, bringing his famous homemade ramen and dumplings for my roommates, a reminder that the best parts of him, the ones that made him my hero all along, were always real, even amid the darkness that nearly consumed us. The experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering, like how I now document everything important, probably to an annoying degree, or how I developed this weird sixth sense about when people are lying to protect me. Sometimes I wake up from these vivid nightmares about Grandpa Gus coming after my future kids someday, which is ridiculous since he's gone. But trauma leaves these weird scars on your brain that don't make logical sense. Robin and I actually grew stronger through all this. Turns out surviving a murder plot with someone really cements your relationship. We got engaged last spring after dating through college, and Dad cried happy tears at the announcement. Judge Carson eventually got 15 years for his role in the corruption, though he only served 3 before being released on medical grounds. Still makes my blood boil. I still keep tabs on his whereabouts through a Google alert, just to be safe. PJ took a completely different path than expected, using his locksmith skills to start a security consulting business specializing in protecting domestic violence survivors, all inspired by what happened to my grandmother. Dad has these moments where he'll just stare at old family photos with this distant look, like he's trying to make peace with all the different versions of his life that could have been. He never remarried, though he's had a few relationships over the years. I think part of him is still working through the guilt of not recognizing Mom's mental health issues sooner. I've become weirdly close with Aunt April now. We text almost daily, and she shared these amazing stories about my grandmother that Grandpa Gus tried to erase. She had this whole life as an amateur painter that nobody ever told me about. I have one of her landscapes hanging in my apartment now. Athena won a regional journalism award for her investigation, which led to reforms in how corruption cases are handled in our state. We meet up for coffee every few months, and she's mentoring me on an independent research project about establishing better safeguards against judicial misconduct. The hardest part of all this has been parsing through the lies to figure out what's actually true about our family history. It's like this constant archaeological dig through memories and stories, trying to separate fact from manipulation. Some days I think I've got it all figured out, and then some random detail will resurface that makes me question everything again. Last month, I found this box of Mom's old journals Dad had kept hidden away, afraid they'd hurt me. Reading them was brutal but necessary. Seeing her descent into paranoia documented in her own handwriting, watching her thoughts become increasingly scattered and dark. But there were beautiful moments too. Pages where she wrote about how much she loved me, her hopes for my future, the joy I brought her before illness took over. In those pages, I finally met my mother, not as a victim or villain in someone else's story, but as a complete person with her own voice. Maybe that's the real lesson in all this. People aren't the simple heroes or monsters we want them to be. Everyone carries these tangled histories that shape them in ways they sometimes can't control. Dad was both the superhero of my childhood and a man with devastating secrets. Grandpa Gus was a monster who still somehow loved me in his twisted way, and I'm still figuring out who I am in the aftermath of it all, carrying pieces of everyone who came before me while trying to build something better from the wreckage of our family tree.